What if everything you thought you knew about this marriage was wrong? Not misunderstood. Not exaggerated. Wrong. Imagine waking up one morning and realizing the love story that cost you your family, your country, your legacy, might not even be legally real. That the paperwork you trusted never told the full story. And worse, that the truth wasn't uncovered by journalists or tabloids, but by intelligence officials whose job is to find what others miss. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. That is the allegation at the center of this storm. Because behind closed doors, whispers began to circulate that MI6 stumbled onto something they weren't even looking for. Not a scandal, not a betrayal, a document. Cold, official, dated. A marriage certificate tied to a name the public was never supposed to connect. And when Prince Harry was confronted with questions about it, sources claim his reaction wasn't denial. It was anger. Ask yourself this. If this were just gossip, why would intelligence agencies be involved at all? Why would records suddenly resurface? And why now? This story isn't about celebrity drama. It's about timelines that don't line up, names that appear where they shouldn't, and a growing realization that the public narrative may have been carefully curated for years. Because when institutions that operate on secrecy start asking questions, it usually means something didn't pass scrutiny. Here's where it gets uncomfortable. Marriage certificates aren't romantic. They're legal instruments. They determine status, succession, protections, and in some cases, national security implications. And when investigators allegedly cross-referenced international records, one certificate raised red flags that couldn't be ignored. Not because of who it involved, but because of when it was issued, dates that overlapped, locations that contradicted public statements, and a name that, once noticed, couldn't be unseen. Joe Guiliano. Most people had never heard it. That alone should tell you something. The deeper analysts looked, the stranger it became. Because this wasn't about one previous relationship. It wasn't even about two. Quietly, a number began to surface in internal discussions. A number that reframed everything. 3 marriages. 3 timelines. 3 versions of the truth. And here's the part that reportedly sent Harry into a spiral. If even one of those records is valid, then the foundation of his own marriage isn't just emotionally compromised. It's legally questionable. What does that do to trust? To identity? To the sacrifices he made believing he was choosing love over duty? Think about it. Would you walk away from everything you've ever known if there was even a chance you were being misled? And if this information existed before, who knew? Who stayed silent? And who benefited from that silence? Because the document MI6 allegedly uncovered wasn't just a piece of paper. It was the first crack in a story that had been presented as airtight. And once that crack appeared, everything built on top of it began to shake. But what investigators found next wasn't just another inconsistency. It was a timeline that made it impossible to look away. If the timeline was wrong, then everything else had to be questioned. Here's the chilling part. Investigators weren't searching for a scandal. They were doing routine background verification, the kind that happens quietly, automatically, without drama. Cross-checks, databases, international registries. The boring stuff no one ever thinks about. Until something doesn't match. One date refused to line up. Then another. And then a name appeared in a place it shouldn't have been, attached to a record that had never been mentioned publicly. Not leaked. Not speculated about. Filed. Logged. Stamped. Ask yourself this. How many people even know how many official marriage registries exist across borders? How many understand how easily something can stay hidden when no one is looking for it? That's the illusion. Things don't stay secret because they're perfectly hidden. They stay secret because no one thinks to check. According to allegations circulating behind palace walls, analysts noticed that one certificate overlapped a period when the public narrative said something very different was happening. Public appearances, interviews, carefully framed timelines that told one clean story. But paperwork doesn't care about optics. It only cares about dates. And dates don't lie. The deeper they dug, the more uncomfortable the questions became. Why would a legally binding document exist during a time when another relationship was already being publicly acknowledged? Why would that document remain valid if subsequent marriages were entered into? And why had no annulment ever surfaced? Here's where tension reportedly exploded. Because when these questions were raised to Harry, it wasn't framed as an accusation. It was framed as clarification. Routine. procedural. But clarification has a way of cutting deeper than confrontation, especially when the answers aren't simple. Imagine being told, not that someone cheated on you, but that your entire understanding of reality might be incomplete. That you weren't betrayed emotionally. You were bypassed legally. Sources claim Harry didn't respond with confusion. He responded with fury. Not loud. Not public. The quiet, dangerous kind. The kind that comes when a man realizes he may have been the last person in the room to know the truth. And here's the contradiction that haunts this chapter. If this document meant nothing, why wasn't it dismissed immediately? Why were follow-up questions ordered? Why did additional records begin surfacing once that first thread was pulled? Because once investigators noticed one inconsistency, they couldn't unsee the others. Additional names appeared in peripheral records, residences that overlapped, travel logs that contradicted public statements. Not proof, but patterns. Enough to force a conclusion no one wanted to voice out loud. This wasn't about one mistake. It was about a structure built on overlapping timelines that were never meant to be examined together. And that leads to the most unsettling realization of all. If this certificate existed, and if it was valid, then it wasn't just history that was rewritten. It was the present. Because the moment that document resurfaced, the question stopped being who Meghan had married before. It became who she was legally married to when she said she wasn't. And what came next would push this story far beyond personal betrayal, straight into territory no one was prepared for. What if the problem wasn't the marriages themselves, but when they happened? That's the question investigators allegedly couldn't shake once the first timeline cracked open. Because a single inconsistency can be dismissed, two can be debated, but three overlapping narratives? That's when coincidence collapses under its own weight. Here's where things turn unsettling. As analysts began mapping dates side by side, a pattern emerged that no public interview ever addressed. One relationship supposedly ended before another began. That's the story everyone knows. Clean, linear, easy to digest. But records don't move in straight lines when the truth is complicated. They stack, they overlap, they collide. And according to internal whispers, that's exactly what happened here. Marriage number one appears to stretch longer than acknowledged. Marriage number two enters the picture before the first is clearly resolved. And then there's the third, the one that changes the entire meaning of the word transition. Because if even one of those unions remained legally intact longer than claimed, it creates a domino effect that reaches straight into the present. Ask yourself this. How often do public figures rely on narrative timing to manage perception? And how rarely does anyone question whether the paperwork agrees? This is where the name Joe Guiliano stops being incidental and starts being unavoidable. Not because of who he is, but because of where his name appears, tied to dates that sit uncomfortably close to moments the public thought were beginnings, not endings. Here's the contradiction that reportedly caused internal alarm. If one marriage had not been legally dissolved, then subsequent marriages wouldn't just be morally questionable. They'd be legally compromised. And that's not a tabloid scandal. That's a structural problem. Now imagine being Prince Harry in that moment. You don't hear, your wife lied to you. You hear, there may be legal overlap. Those words land differently. Overlap suggests omission. It suggests strategy. It suggests you weren't given the full picture. Not because it was forgotten, but because it was inconvenient. Sources claim this realization hit harder than any rumor ever could. Because gossip can be denied, but timelines demand explanation. And the more Harry reportedly pressed for clarity, the less clean the answers became. Here's another uncomfortable detail. If these records were accessible to intelligence services, they weren't hidden in some obscure vault. They were available, just never cross-referenced in this way before. Which raises a chilling question. Was this ignorance, or was it reliance on the assumption that no one would ever look this closely? The emotional tone shifts here from anger to something darker. Disorientation. The kind that comes when your past decisions start feeling like they were made with incomplete information. When you realize the love story you defended so fiercely may have been built on selective disclosure. And then comes the implication no one wanted to say out loud. If timelines overlapped, if legal closures didn't happen when claimed, then the issue isn't just who Meghan married before. It's whether the marriage to Harry began on solid ground at all. Because if it didn't, then everything tied to it, titles, decisions, sacrifices, exists in a legal gray zone that no one has prepared the public for. And just when investigators thought they'd reached the most explosive conclusion, another question surfaced. One that shifted the focus away from the past entirely. Who knew about this before Harry did? And that question would lead to consequences far more dangerous than any broken trust. If the marriage wasn't legally clean, then the fallout wouldn't be emotional. It would be irreversible. Here's the line that reportedly stopped everyone in the room cold. If a prior marriage was still legally intact, then the next one doesn't simply become controversial. It becomes questionable in law. Not a matter of opinion, not a matter of feelings, a matter of validity. Think about that for a second. Love can survive betrayal. Reputations can survive scandal. But legality? Legality doesn't bend to sentiment. It either stands or it collapses. This is where the focus allegedly shifted away from Meghan entirely and locked onto Harry. Because if there was even a possibility that his marriage rested on unstable legal ground, then he wasn't just a victim of deception, he was exposed. Personally, publicly, historically, and exposure at that level changes how institutions react. According to sources familiar with the internal panic, questions began stacking rapidly. What would this mean for decisions already made? For statements already issued? For sacrifices that were framed as noble but might now appear tragically misinformed? Ask yourself this. How do you process the idea that you gave up everything for something that may not have legally existed the way you believed it did? The irony is brutal. A prince who rejected tradition to follow his heart, now trapped by the most rigid system of all, documentation. Signatures, dates, records that don't care about intention. Here's where the emotional temperature shifts again. This isn't rage anymore. This is reckoning. Because if Harry was the last to know, that means others may have known first. Advisors, gatekeepers, people who understood the implications and chose silence over clarity. And silence, in this context, isn't neutral. It's consequential. One insider described the realization like this. The ground didn't disappear all at once. It cracked slowly, piece by piece, until standing still felt impossible. Every memory recontextualized. Every defense re-examined. Every choice suddenly heavy with what-ifs. And there's another layer people aren't talking about. If this issue ever moves from internal concern to public scrutiny, it won't unfold like a normal scandal. There won't be a single headline or a neat resolution. It would be death by 1,000 questions, each one reopening wounds, each one forcing explanations no one rehearsed. Which brings us to the most dangerous implication of all. If this information exists, and if it was known by more than one party, then the real story isn't about how many marriages there were. It's about who managed the truth. Because secrets don't survive on their own. They survive because someone protects them. And once investigators began asking who had access, who had awareness, and who had motive to stay quiet, the spotlight shifted away from paperwork entirely. It moved toward people. And that's when this story stopped being about the past and started pointing directly at what comes next. So let's go back to the question we started with. What if everything you thought you knew about this marriage was wrong? Not because of gossip, not because of rumors, but because the truth may have been hiding in plain sight, stamped, filed, and quietly ignored. At this point, the story is no longer about how many marriages came before. It's about what happens when reality collides with belief. When a man looks back at the biggest decision of his life and realizes it may have been built on information he never had the chance to fully understand. Think about Prince Harry's position for a moment. He didn't just choose a partner. He chose exile. He chose confrontation. He chose to stand against an institution he was born into, all in the name of love, loyalty, and truth. And now, according to these allegations, he may be asking himself a question no one ever wants to ask. What if I was fighting for a story that wasn't complete? That's the kind of realization that doesn't explode. It sinks in slowly, quietly. It rewrites memories. It forces you to revisit conversations, reassess moments that once felt certain. And it leaves you wondering which version of events you were responding to all along. The most haunting part of this story isn't the documents themselves. It's the silence around them. Because if records existed, if timelines overlapped, if questions were raised before they ever reached Harry, then the real issue becomes accountability. Who knew? Who suspected? And who decided that not knowing was safer than telling? This is where the story becomes bigger than one couple. It becomes a warning about power, narrative control, and the cost of believing a version of events simply because it was repeated often enough. Truth doesn't always shout. Sometimes it waits patiently until someone finally looks in the right place. And here's the takeaway that should stay with you. Even the most carefully managed image can unravel when dates stop lining up. Even the strongest emotional bond can fracture when trust meets contradiction. And even a prince can find himself questioning whether the foundation beneath him was ever as solid as he believed. So now the question shifts to you. If you were in Harry's position, would you want to know everything, even if it shattered what you thought was real? Or would you rather protect the story you sacrificed everything to defend? Because this chapter may be ending, but this story isn't over. There are still unanswered questions, still people who haven't spoken, still connections that haven't been publicly examined. And if witnesses ever step forward, this conversation will change again, fast. If you want to follow what happens next, make sure you stay connected. Subscribe, share your thoughts in the comments, and tell me this one thing. Do you think the truth was hidden, or simply never questioned? Because the next revelation won't come from paperwork. It will come from someone deciding they're done keeping quiet.